exciting. My very first guest here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center is a New York Times best-selling author. Most famously, he wrote the novel Wicked, for which the very successful Broadway show was based. He has a new book called Hidden Sea, A Tale of the Once and Future Nutcracker, and I'm so excited to have him in the studio with me today. Gregory Maguire, please come on in. Hi.
Hi there, how are you?
Doing great. Gregory, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Your newest book, based, of course, on the Nutcracker story that we all know, the holiday story. Tell us a little bit about how you chose this to be your next sort of children's story fairy tale that you chose to write about.
Well, first I should say it's a bit strange, isn't it, to have me be a grown-up who might have been in medicine or public policy or higher education, and what I'm doing with the skills and interests and energy that I have in my life is taking the stories that we knew and loved in childhood and trying to unpack them and give them to readers now that we are all grown-ups and we need some real consolation. That's been the sort of métier that I've relied on to power myself through 38 novels in 38 years. But this one, with its subtitle,
Amazing.
The Once and Future Nutcracker, is, as it sounds, a little bit in the Wicked mode in that it takes a story that we all know, the story of the Nutcracker and the fight with the King of the Mice and poor Clara on Christmas Eve,
Yes.
and it tries to unpack it by asking some basic questions about what is wrong with this story. I mean, have you ever seen the Nutcracker?
I have,
Now,
yes.
let me tell you, ask you, have you seen it 400 times, or does it just feel like you've seen it 400 times?
I have definitely seen it multiple times, dozens of times. I even performed in it as
really?
a kid. Yes, I was a
Who
dancer.
were you?
I was
Mouse number 40?
usually, the little ones are always the mice. I think I was Waltz of the Flowers.
Oh, good.
So I was a flower, which is nice.
That's one of the memorable pieces of
Right,
music.
it is, yeah.
What I find about the ballet, and I've only seen it I think once, but I've seen it on video a number of times, is that the story is basically demented.
Which I feel like a lot of
insane.
kids' stories are. Like the nursery rhymes, there's always something a little off about them, I've noticed.
Well, that's true, but this one is even more than usual because this one is sort of, I don't want to go medical, but it's kind of schizophrenic. The first act is a traditional children's story that has a fight for good and evil, in this case represented by the King of the Mice and the brave stalwart Nutcracker and Clara, the damsel in distress, who ends up sort of saving him. And then Act 2 comes along, and it's like seeing the slides from your great-grandparents trip around the world when they were retired.
Yes,
and they were
it's
gone
so
for
true.
8 months, and they had every single country they ever visited. And the minute Act 2 starts, you start thinking, did I put enough money in the meter? And what if I have to go to the bathroom? And what am I going to do? I mean, the music is gorgeous.
Right.
We can't live without that music. And Tchaikovsky's wonderful score illuminated and re-energized this story that was always sort of hobbled and wobbly and limping, even from when it was first published in 1816 as one of the very first original fantastic stories written and published for children. So I wanted
wow,
to take
interesting.
the story and figure out how I could make the trip around the world in Act 2 conform with the story of Clara and the Nutcracker and weird old Godfather Drosselmeyer, remember, with his eye
With his
patch.
eye, yes.
And I decided I would do what I did in Wicked, which is to take one character, in this case Godfather Drosselmeyer, and I would start with how he's a child, take him through his life, and figure out how he got to be in that parlor on Christmas Eve with Clara as his goddaughter, and how he got the kind of canniness and the whittling skills in order to be able to make her a savior in the form of that Nutcracker.
It is. It's so beautiful, and it's so nostalgic for people. These are stories that people have a connection to, and especially a story like this that is so closely related to the holiday season. People have a lot of sentimentality based on that. Did you feel that you wanted to help preserve some of that sentimentality, or do you think this is something completely different and you don't need to adhere to any preconceived feelings.
Well, one of the things that we feel about the story of the Nutcracker, I think, is the sense of magic in the transformations. Do you remember the great scene, at least in the Balanchine version of the ballet, I think it is, where the Christmas tree starts on stage, a normal tree, and then it grows and grows and grows and expands to be 45 feet tall, thereby shrinking all the humans so that they now look like the size of mice. It is one of the most magical moments in theater design, I think. And that moment alone makes us feel like what it's like to be children and what it's like to believe in magic. So what I wanted to do was to take this story for adults and say, the place in our human lives, which are, let's face it, sorry and dyspeptic and corrupted and frightened, and I wanted to reinvigorate them with a sense of the only place that we can really reliably find magic anymore, which is in the hearts and minds of children. So I tried to bring that Christmas tree magic into the story of a man who, let's face it, is a man with a lot of troubles and a man of sorrows and a man without a great many joys in his life.
Right, he has his shortcomings for sure.
Yes.
There is sort of some of what you do, especially in this book and in Wicked, you know, kind of going back and figuring out what happened to these characters beforehand that caused them to become evil or questionable.
Right.
It's almost psychological. It's almost like psychology. Do you think of it that way, or do you think of it just as character development?
Well, the stories always provide some weird clues. I mean, if I said Godfather Drosselmeyer and you actually knew who he was, and you do, I would say, well, what do we know about him? You'd say, well, we know there doesn't seem to be any, Mama Drosselmeyer, so he's not married. Is that weird? Doesn't have to be weird, but is it weird? And also we know he has an eye patch. Remember?
Yes.
Now, what does that mean, that he has an eye patch? Well, there's got to be a reason why he has the eye patch. People just don't walk around with eye patches just because
because they think it's cool.
They're not Madonna.
Yeah.
It's not style. It's not a fashion statement. He had to have lost his eye somehow. How did that happen? And so I try to take the clues that are really there and think, well, how does one lose an eye? One way is getting it poked out with a stick. So, happy Christmas story.
I know. Merry Christmas. But you are able to create that backstory, and then as the story continues, the reader is like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, now I get it.
Yeah.
That must be so fun for you to sort of, use the end result, which is this fairy tale or story that we all know and love, and kind of work backwards.
Right, it's a bit forensic. I'm kind of
like exactly.
Miss Marple or Murder She Wrote or Hercule Poirot. I'm kind of trying to figure out, well, how could this have come to be? And furthermore, which I think the question you were really asking me, what is the psychological implication of being part blind? If you're part blind, what is it that you actually see with your blind eye?
Right.
And if you can see something with your blind eye that those of us double-sighted, binocular vision can't catch, what is it? Is that where magic leaches through the seams of ordinary sad life?
Right, exactly. It's so wonderful to get inside these characters in that way. In this particular story, as I said, it is a Christmas story. Did you intend to do something that would sort of appeal to the holiday season, or just a coincidence that the Nutcracker was a good topic?
It's funny. I will take this. I suggested to the publisher that we not put red and green on the cover because I didn't want it to be sequestered only with the holiday books and then get dumped out in the trash on January 2nd.
Right, true.
So instead, the wonderful book designer used a traditional German sort of art form called something like Scherenschnippe. It's like cut paper. That's not the exact German word, so don't flood the studio with corrections. I know it's wrong. But so he got this. It almost looks sort of Dutch Amish, doesn't it?
Yep.
It looks sort of naive. But then when you open it up and you see the inside cover, you see
I love it.
Herr Drosselmeyer kind of paralyzed with the golden walnut in his throat. Paralyzed, impotent, but also in a weird way capable. And so I did part of the book design myself. I
Oh,
didn't
wow.
draw the picture,
Yeah.
but I did part of the book design with the
concept.
publisher. Yes.
Oh,
so,
it's beautiful.
So I'm really, really happy with it. But I wanted it to appeal to people who like to buy books at Christmas time and
Right.
at the holidays particularly. But I didn't want it to be balkanized or imprisoned in the December 2nd to December 28th bin.
Right. It is so much more than that, obviously, yes. You were talking a little bit about the German influence, and so I was wondering about your process of writing. What type of research goes into it? I mean, besides knowing the fairy tale or story inside and out so that you can sort of pick up on those clues, what type of research would you have to do in a situation like this, where this is set in early 1800 Germany?
Right.
Did you have to, learn about
Well,
what the culture was
I don't
like?
Know, I don't know German, I'll tell you that. But what I did do, I did several things. One is that I read a number of biographies of people who lived in that time so that I could hear how people talked even about their domestic arrangements.
Right.
I read a biography of Franz Mesmer, who is the kind of quack doctor who sort of anticipated Freud, you might say, in his interest in something that we now call the subconscious. And I went to the place where he died, which is the town of Meersburg in Germany, and because there needed to be a great revelation in the mind of Drosselmeyer when he was a boy about 16, the fact that Herr Mesmer died in the 1820s meant I had to work backwards to figure out when my boy could be born, so that he could be only 18 in the last year of Mesmer's life, so Mesmer could, kind of hypnotize him and bring him to his deeper memories of deep childhood. That meant that I knew the boy had to be born in 1808. And guess what else was happening in 1808 in that part of Germany? The Brothers Grimm were going into the forests and trying to find the stories that have become really the central, fundamental plinth of children's literature in Germany, in England, and in the United States. So all of it began to fall together. It was just like being in that commission that's trying to figure out who shot JFK.
Yeah.
I keep finding clues and I have more
Right.
theories. It's great.
Oh, it's amazing. So getting deeper into your process now, do you come up with variations, or do you get an idea and run with it? For example, do you say, he could have lost an eye by poking it out with a stick, he could have lost an eye this way, that way? How does your process generally work?
Well, it's funny because I was talking about Mesmer and the fact, of his sort of inventing a certain kind of hypnotism. And yet, in a sense, I suppose, once I get the concept of the story and the theme that is going to power me through the story, I do let myself sort of be hypnotized by the life that is unfolding itself as I'm writing it down. It's not quite magic writing because I do make choices, but I make choices with aesthetic and artistic instinct rather than necessarily intellectual. Intellectual instinct builds the pen that I'm going to be working in, or let's say hammers up the canvas on the panel.
Right.
But aesthetic instinct says, let me grab this red and let me splash some yellow. Oh no, too much yellow,
Right,
and I work by habit and just by deep knowledge of what might work and satisfy me as a reader. My goal, of course, is to sell 100 million books, but
That's always nice.
But my deep goal is to write a book that I would have fallen over to find in the library this year myself, to satisfy, console myself, and in so doing, I hope to console you.
And you do have a deep love for children's stories and appealing to children, or when you're writing for adults, as you said, appealing to the sort of childlike qualities that we as adults have, which I think is really lovely. How did you decide that was sort of the direction you wanted to go as a writer?
Well, it's funny. I realized that in most of our public discourse as grown-ups, and people are writing and talking about this all the time, increasingly we tend to choose the populations that we're going to hang out with, whether it's the news we're going to watch or the restaurants we're going to go to or the places we're going to vacation. We want to be comfortable. We want, likes like, as they say. And that makes us more sequestered in our own bubbles of worlds and doesn't really help us communicate with people who are not thinking or feeling or believing exactly the same way we do. People who are of a different race or different financial bracket or different ethnicity or religious system or none. So I began to think that one of the few things we still all have in common is that we all emerge from the nation of childhood.
Yeah.
And that when we get these stories, when we get the Nutcracker, or when we get the Grimm fairy tales, we're not Jewish and Christian, we're not Democrat and Republican, we're not even black and white. We're kids hungering after story. And so one of the things I realized is that if I write from our common language that we have not yet decided how to chop up and own separately, then I can try to speak to everybody. And if, after all, isn't that what art does? It tries to reach everybody, not just the people in the room who already agree with you.
Right.
So that my attempt is to be welcoming, to be magnanimous, and to sort of open the door of a new world. Isn't it funny how a book is like a door? Open a door to a new world, and nobody is forbidden. Everybody is welcome.
I love that idea. I love it, and it's very true. I want to talk just quickly about Wicked, because what a phenomenon. I mean, I can't imagine being a writer, and Wicked was sort of the first...
It was my first adult novel.
Yeah,
yes,
and using this kind of concept of I'm going to take a story that we know and sort of write, I don't know, a prequel or a character development for it. And then it becomes one of the most successful Broadway shows of all time. Do you now feel pressure as a writer to live up to that? What does that do to you as a writer to have that kind of success?
Well, it's funny. It's true that, Wicked has been referenced on The Simpsons and on South Park and in lots of other TV movies and other places. And furthermore, the week that I was a clue on Jeopardy was the same week that John Updike admired Wicked in The New Yorker. So, in a way, I say, I was covered with this great green cloud, and I might have become dysfunctional by it. It's such a greater success than people who are in the arts expect ever to achieve.
Yes.
Let's face it, we go into what we do because we love it, not because we want, to make $1 billion. However, luckily, a couple of years before Wicked, the musical opened, when my book had already been successful enough, it had sold almost 1 million copies before the musical opened. The success of the book gave me the financial legs that allowed me to adopt the first of my 3 adopted children. And so I adopted 3 kids in between 1999 and 2002. The play opened in 2003. And all the hoopla of Broadway, I'll admit, I was tempted to just kind of float down, Broadway and live on West 52nd Street for the rest of my life. But the kids needed Cheerios, and they needed carting to preschool, and they needed doctor's appointments, and they needed me more than Broadway needed me. So in a funny way, to the extent that I do have any backbone or any mental competence, and to the extent that my career has not been overshadowed by this enormous success that I didn't anticipate, I really have my kids to thank because they came along at just the right time to save me from the temptation of adulation.
Oh, that's amazing. Kids do that,
Yeah,
don't they?
they
definitely
bring
keep you
down.
grounded.
If you're getting up too high for your britches, they will actually chew your ankles and fell you so that you can crawl to the kitchen cabinet and get them their Cheerios.
That is very true, and I think you're right. As an artist, as a creator, you can fall into a terrible trap by trying to chase something that was successful.
Right.
Because now you're not creating from a genuine place. You're creating from like, I wonder if they're going to like this. Maybe they'll like that.
Right. Now it
place.
is true though. It is true that I was kind of branded. There is a Gregory Maguire brand, and after Wicked, I wrote a book that I sent to my publisher and said, "Here's my next book," and she wrote back after about a week and said, I loved it. I sat up all night and read it. I laughed myself sick. It'll never sell. What else are you working on? And I said, I had those 3 kids to feed. And I said,
Yeah.
well, I was thinking of something called, I didn't have any other ideas. and then that part of the subconscious that Mesmer taught us about and Freud said, Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. And I thought, oh, I've never even thought of that, but it's coming out, the words coming out of my mouth.
Right now, yeah.
And so that was my second book about the Cinderella story set in Holland in 1628, Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister. So I was, in fact, a little bit imprisoned by my success, but I actually, it was partly because the next book was also successful that I thought, why are these working? Why are these working? And then I came up with that thesis I have that, in fact, we all care about the magic that we believed in childhood. And my books are not easy to read. They're not really beach reads. They're intellectual novels disguised as retellings of children's stories. But they are also retellings of children's stories, and they do throw out the Christmas-colored welcome mat and say, or a Hanukkah-covered welcome mat, and say, "Come on in, everybody. You're all welcome. Here's your hot chocolate, and here's your nutmeg."
It's sort of like you created your own genre. Is there a name for it? Do you have a name for it?
That's a really good question. I will say, I acknowledge my forebears. Many people have done this before. There's a famous, Jean Rhys wrote a novel called Wide Sargasso Sea about the backstory of the demented madwoman in the attic in Jane Eyre, I guess it was. And also John Gardner wrote the story Grendel about Beowulf's nemesis, the monster that Beowulf kills. So I wasn't the first. I don't claim to have invented it, but I do think that it has grown vastly since